Oh, Debbie, that sounds fantastic. You wrote a nonfiction book about book design. That sounds really interesting. Debbie, is that published yet? If it's published, will you drop the link in the chat for us? That's Debbie in Oakland, who wrote a nonfiction book about book design. That is so cool. So glad to hear that. So welcome, everybody. If you are just jumping in, please feel free to drop in the chat where you are coming from, what you are currently working on. So glad to see so many old friends here and friends from last year. I'll give y'all just a super quick update before we dive in and start on time. After being run over by a scooter the night before New Year's Eve, I am now in surprisingly good condition. I had a hearing test today and both ears hear exactly the same, and it's normal, except I can't hear that really high-pitched sound that only teenagers can hear. And when you get to a certain age, you can't hear that sound anymore. So in Britain, they actually play that sound in areas where they don't want teenagers to congregate at night because it only bothers the teenagers. It is a whistle that only teenagers can hear. But things are going very well. And I got a lot of emails and a lot of Twitters and everything, and I'm getting ready to respond to all of them. But thank you all for caring. It's really nice that you care. So welcome back to the Writer's Bridge. I'm Allison K. Williams, and with me is our co-host, Charla Yates, and our fabulous guest, Jane Friedman, who we will introduce properly in a minute. You may have noticed as the turn of the year happened that a lot is changing on the publishing and platform scene. It feels like agents are less responsive than ever, but maybe they're getting caught up. We're all learning that platform is not just a checklist of clicks and connections. It is a series of regular activities that you got to do on a pretty regular basis, but they support your writing and they enhance your life and your community. But right now, Twitter's weird, Tumblr's back, Substack is everywhere. Charlotte, you told me the other day that you hated Twitter. Tell us your thoughts on Twitter.
It's maybe hate's a strong word. I feel like I'm jumping on Twitter when everyone else is hopping off. At least that's what I'm being told. I really don't have a way to gauge that myself. I do feel overwhelmed by the interface, but I'm trying to figure it out because Craft Talks is a way that we connect to people about Craft Talks. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a new webinar series that Allison and I are starting up on writing for writers. And in fact, we have one that's happening tomorrow, which is bringing place to the page, about how to use place, landscape, setting, and in evocative ways in your writing. And I'll pop a link about that in the chat box if you feel like you're not in the know and you want to be. But yeah, I guess all that's to say is if you follow me on Twitter, if you're a new follower of mine, please be patient as I'm learning it. Yeah.
It is really fun to see Charlotte, and Charlotte, I say this with great love in my heart, because I'm guessing that you and I, and Jane, I can't speak for you, but this might have been you too, that we were firmly seated at the people who read while eating and not talk to other people cafeteria table. And that's kind of sometimes how I feel on Twitter, like I'm the big dork at the party. So we will talk about that today. Charlotte, will you go ahead and introduce Jane? And folks, we're going to take your questions throughout, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Over to you, Charla.
Jane Friedman has 20 years of experience in the publishing industry with expertise in business strategy for authors and publishers. She's the co-founder and editor of The Hot Sheet, a paid newsletter for authors, and has previously worked for Writer's Digest and Virginia Quarterly Review. Jane's latest book, The Business of Being a Writer, is a staple on many writers' bookshelves, including my own.
Me too.
Proof. In addition to being a professor with the great courses, Jane's expertise has been featured by the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and many other outlets. Thanks for being here, Jane.
Welcome, Jane. We're so glad to have you. Feel free to jazz hands, people, if you want to do a little visual applause there. Jane, do you want to add anything? Do you have anything really exciting coming up before we dive right into quizzing you on the world of publishing and platform?
No, not necessarily. I am the most steady and boring person career-wise. It's what I'm doing this year is the same thing that I did last year.
Me too. Me too. Although I have to say, it's kind of nice to be able to say that as a person in a creative profession. So In the past 2 years of the Writers Bridge, we have seen you, the members of our community, publish with Big Five, publish in newspapers, publish in magazines, do hybrid publishing, do self-publishing, and many of us are still on that road. Jane, it feels like it's harder than ever to get a Big Five deal or even get a decent literary or indie press. Is this just like writer sadness? What are you seeing, and why is it happening?
Well, I've been in the industry for so long at this point. I do have the big picture perspective, which is there has never been a time when someone said it was easier to get published. I think it's possible that it feels tougher now, if only because there's a generation, the baby boomer generation, that is now has the time and resource, whereas maybe they didn't before, to write and publish. So we might be seeing more activity on like a generational level from that perspective. But from where I sit, it's as difficult as it's ever been. There may be some complicating factors related to platform, but platform, the demands that agents or publishers, or the expectations that they have, I mean, that's been there for 20 years at this point. So I think certainly we talk about platform in different ways, and that has changed a lot, and we'll talk about some of those changes, but I don't necessarily think it's tougher, although I think there are more people jumping in and more people pitching, and I think the skill level of writers has improved a lot since I got into the business, because there are just more resources, and a lot of them are affordable and accessible, which I consider a good thing. So everyone has to level up their game accordingly.
Yeah, and it feels like agents are quitting and the ones that are still in the game aren't really answering their emails. Is that a real perception, or is that reality?
I mean, what's so frustrating about this is there is like no official statistics on how many agents are out there. The closest thing we have to counting any of this is Publishers Marketplace and its deals database, which it's not perfect. It's not the entire picture. I would say I've seen a lot of consolidation, like agencies consolidating with each other or merging. But it's hard for me to say, oh yeah, agents are leaving in droves. It's the same sort of churn that I've always seen. There may be more agents and editors and people in publishing generally talking about burnout, and that's been affected by the pandemic. But I don't really have an opinion on whether there are more or less agents. To me, it just feels the same as it's always been.
I got to say, when I queried my first and second books that did not get published, they weren't good enough yet. I queried more than 100 agents for each book in several rounds. But I have a list on Twitter of agents, and there's 1,000 agents on that list. And I'm sure they're not all good. I'm sure they don't all rep what I'm writing, but it seems like there's a lot of them out there. It just feels like no response means no has started to become the default here, which is kind of sad and horrible.
Yes, I think that is something that has definitely changed. This lack of response, the ghosting, the lack of any sort of form letter rejection, which I know some writers take very personally. Like it's seen as a courtesy to at least respond to an inquiry. But if I'm right that there are more writers out there than ever, there's more competition than ever, I think that what we're seeing is that agents and publishers too are overwhelmed with submissions. And having been on the receiving end of that, I'm perhaps more sympathetic than the average person. And this is all work that's on top of what they have to do for their, to make money, to serve their existing clients or their existing authors. It's not a money-making activity. And I think it's important to remember that. And often agents and publishers alike already have a stream of material coming in that's actually been recommended or referred. And so they just run out of time, and it costs a lot of money in terms of hours or hiring assistants to respond to the hundreds and ultimately thousands of submissions that come in every year. I'm not saying any of this, like the non-response is justified. It's just trying to put in perspective what they're up against.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that helped me understand is agents are working for free when they're reading submissions. This is not work that generates income for them. And so it really does take last place because they've got to do all the stuff that makes money and that serves their existing clients first. We have and Jill adds in the chat too, her agent has a new draft of her manuscript, which is fairly urgent, but she told me she would add it to the pile. She is reading so much. My manuscript alone is 160 pages. We have an agent-specific question from the chat. Rebecca asks, I'm working on a middle grade novel and a memoir. A Big Five publication reached out for me, a publisher reached out for me to write the middle grade novel. If they take it, they'll give me a list of agents to reach out to. Should I look primarily for an agent who does middle grade YA, or should I look for an agent who does both middle grade and memoir, since she's got the memoir in the pipeline?
I mean, if one of those agents on the list you were given represents both, I would certainly gravitate toward the one that does both. But I think it's more important to choose someone that you are going to trust, respect, believe will represent your interests. And I think you don't want to look too far down the road, because there's so many potential things that could happen once you've got the agent for the first book. They could refer you to another agent and their agency to take care of the memoir if they don't feel like they can represent it. They might refer you themselves to an agent, because this won't be the first time they've had to, like if they represent a very narrow set of projects, let's say they only represent children's, they're probably accustomed to referring clients to someone who will deal with the adult work, for example. So I wouldn't tie yourself up in knots just yet over it. Just find the agent who's best for you for the children's work. And then certainly in your conversation with them before, you seal the deal that they're your agent, ask them how they would handle this sort of scenario if they can't or don't want to sell the memoir.
Nina has a question. Nina says, Jane, can you remind us when the best times, months, or seasons during the year it is to pitch agents and indies and university publishers and presses?
And this is
the best time of year.
I have to ask if it's a serious question, because I did a whole Twitter thread spoofing the timing question.
You're being serious.
I don't think there is an ideal time. And the only ideal time is the ideal time for you to move through the process. Now, obviously, you want to follow submission guidelines and pay attention to when agents or editors say they're open or closed. But other than that, I would not worry at all about the timing. If you psychologically feel like, oh, the holidays would be a terrible time, then don't query during the holidays. But I would not, follow any of the conventional wisdom that says, oh, you can't query in August because publishing's on vacation. Or March is when they all gather on a Skull Island to make fun of their submissions. Like, there's so many theories about the best time to query, and I would just forget all of it.
I think that's a really great point, because I live in Dubai. Thanksgiving is not really a holiday here, but Thanksgiving is a big holiday in the United States. And there's 4 days in November when my inbox slows right down. For me, I have one lovely afternoon with a goose or something involved in it. But the rest of the time, Thanksgiving is a great time to catch up on email for me. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. So what do you think is selling books to agents and publishers right now? What do you think they're buying? And does that have any connection to what readers are actually buying? Because publishers sure did not buy Colleen Hoover to begin with, and she is dominating the front table in every bookstore I walk into. And I also want to say too, I picked up a Colleen Hoover book in the Netherlands because I just wanted to see what's the big deal. And the few pages I read made me cry. It is not great literature, but she is a strong, effective writer, and people are buying the heck. So I think, being mad about Colleen Hoover is like demanding that people eat their broccoli before they have their ice cream. What do you think? What are they buying, Jane?
Well, often you see a lot of excitement and enthusiasm around what's performing well, let's say over the last year or so. Now, you have to be careful when, obviously, when you look at these sorts of trends, because publishing is slow and it takes a while for books to come out. So, for example, if we go back to around the time Trump was first elected, there was a huge upswell in books speaking to why was he elected? What don't we understand about America that he got into office? A lot of nonfiction, political, social justice books then came in around 2020, I think, for reasons that everyone knows about. But now, during that time, during like, say, 2016 to 2020, nonfiction was hot. But now nonfiction is declining. And right now we're seeing an upswell in fiction of all kinds, especially romance, which had one of its best years last year. Why is that? Colleen Hoover, romance was the best-selling category. We're seeing horror doing much better. We're seeing fantasy doing really well, but not so much science fiction. So I do think there's a lot of enthusiasm right now, in particular for fiction. There's a lot of attention on TikTok. I'm sure everyone here already knows that. But, chasing that, I'm always very reticent to suggest you pay too close of attention. But of course, it's nice to know if the wind is blowing in your favor. So I think on a broad level, that's what's working right now, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't pitch that nonfiction book or that memoir or that social justice book. It just means that it might be a little more challenging at this moment in time because the enthusiasm is elsewhere.
Yeah, Karen has a question. Isn't it more appealing to have a couple books packaged together? I am editing my first book and I have a second book in the pipeline. Would this delay my query?
2 books packaged together. Normally, the rule is you pitch one book at a time until someone expresses interest in what else you have. So normally when you do get interest in that first project, the agent definitely wants to know what else you're working on. The publisher will probably be curious too. But I wouldn't go out in your query letter or in your proposal presenting a package. Unless it's an agent who's encouraging you to do that, and they will have very specific reasons for encouraging that based on their knowledge of the publishing house or your genre or category. So there are a lot of variables here, but the general principle is one book at a time.
Lisa has a great question. What's the strongest opening for a fiction agent? Open with the world, open with the character. What do they really want to see? I've been successful getting agent rep for memoir, but not fiction. Jane, will you please look into the mind of all fiction agents and tell me, what do they want?
Well, you put your best foot forward, and that's going to differ for each writer. Now, certainly with fiction, it's more common that you would query starting with something amazing about the premise of the book, or why it's going to resonate right now, which is typically done with a sort of an X meets Y comparison, where X and Y are something that people are excited about, or it indicates your new fresh angle or take on it. There was a blog post at my site recently, I'll pull up the link, about from a guest who said, what I learned from 90 queries. And what I found so amazing about this guest post was how the writer didn't see what was marketable or saleable about her book herself. But as soon as she figured that out and was able to express it in the query, it got her representation. Now, I'm greatly simplifying, what happened there. But I think a lot of times writers, it's true, they don't put in the query what's going to attract an agent's or editor's attention, but I don't know that it's necessarily what do I want to say? It's not that you have a bad book or that you're not writing on trend, but you just haven't identified the sizzle. And so figuring out what that sizzle is usually how fiction queries are successful.
And I want to weigh in on that as well. I offer query editing. It's something, Jane, that you used to do a lot of, and I think you only do it in connection with webinars now. But one of the things I've noticed, because I just edited a query tonight before this meeting, So many queries start with backstory instead of with the inciting incident of the book. So one of the things to think about is look at your query and start the query with, when Susie hits Bobby with her car, it's hardly a meet cute, but it turns into a match made in heaven, rather than starting with Susie has moved to Rainbow Cove after the death of her fiance and has opened a small baking store where blah, blah, blah. And then it's like form reject all over the place. So start with the action if you possibly can.
Great advice.
Shannon has a question about theme. I don't know if you have a crystal ball, but how long do you think the theme of reproductive justice will be topical?
I don't know, but obviously it's top of mind for many women, especially liberal women in publishing. So if it's the story you want to write, and especially if it's the story you wanted to write prior to the Dobbs decision, go for it. There are some things, some themes, and I think that's one of them, that there's always going to be interest in it. It's just, are you writing about it in a way that helps shed new light or that twists it? So it's not just the theme that's important, but how you use it in the storytelling, where does this feel like something predictable, like something we've seen a million times before? So regardless of whether or not the theme is topical or related to the headlines, we have to see that fresh light or that new take.
Jill has a great question that kind of ties into that. Is identifying the sizzle equally important for nonfiction? Is voice part of the sizzle? I'm writing a relatively quiet interior book without a super sexy hook, unless postpartum anxiety is sexy.
So I would say with nonfiction, it's even more important than fiction in my experience. Now it's going to depend on what sort of nonfiction book we're talking about. And it sounds like in this particular case, it's a memoir. And certainly an idea-driven nonfiction, you can almost, the book gets pitched and sold and it gets on the media because of the sizzle. So every agent and publisher is looking at the media potential, the breakout potential, something that can be boiled down into a sentence or two. There's an editor, Eric Nelson, who summarized that as the big switch that you want to flip, where you're boiling everything down to this single argument, like, don't eat lunch alone, Allison, because that's going to inhibit your networking and career building. So always don't eat lunch alone. That's actually a book that's out there, premise, like boiling an entire problem of career building into this one simple action you can take. A lot of nonfiction sells based on that. Or, for example, a book I just read called Quit. It boils everything down to the power of knowing the precise moment when you should walk away from something, whether it's a job, a relationship, something else. So, but with memoir, I do feel like if you're not a celebrity, the great bulk of memoir gets sold because of the voice, because you have this insane story and people want to live vicariously through this insane thing that you experienced. Like Wild would fall into that category. And usually the memoir will sell because of that insane experience and people want to know more about it, or because your writing is just, I'm falling out of my chair and I would read your grocery list. So yes, there's a chance, but obviously it puts a big burden on the writer for that, for the voice, for the style, for the writing to just knock people's socks off.
I second Quit. I think it's a great book, and Lisa says that they have to read it. I agree. It's really good. Haven't finished it yet. Diana has a question. How should writers position their works if they're not on trend? And how long do the average trends last?
The second part is easier to speak to. So I would say in book publishing, trends tend to span 3 to 5 years, roughly. Please don't set your timers now for the enemies to lovers trend. Actually, that's been around forever. That's not going to go away. But so what was the first part of that question?
Oh, yes. How should writers position their works if they're not on trend?
Well, fortunately, I do think publishing is very forgiving. Like it's, in my opinion, it's one of the entertainment industries we've got where there's probably more emphasis on the evergreen quality of the work, or the way that it has relevance beyond a very particular moment in time. I was actually just reading a piece in The Pudding that looks at the books assigned for college students in the 80s, in the 90s, and the 2000s. And it's fascinating to see how, for some books, it's almost like they were released before their time, and then they become relevant again because of current events. And this happens again and again in both fiction and nonfiction. So, I mean, too bad for those authors that they didn't zoom up the bestseller lists when they were first released, but books tend to have very long lives. So editors and agents know this, even if, the rejections say otherwise. So I do think everyone's looking for the book that has legs.
Yeah. And I think too, it's really hard to tailor your book to a specific trend, because by the time your book gets picked up by an agent, that's 6 months. By the time the agent sells it to a publisher, that's 6 months. And by the time the publisher gets it to the shelf, that's anywhere from 18 months to 3 years. Mm-hmm. So it is better to focus on what you feel passionately called to write about. And if it's not a trend, make it a trend. Maybe you're the person who starts the trend. I want to swing to platform for a bit. So Twitter seems to have sort of stabilized. Post didn't take off. I have no idea what's happening with Hive. Mastodon is just confusing. Instagram is trying to be TikTok. And as far as TikTok goes, I am "you kids get off my lawn" years old. How are writers connecting to their audiences now? And I want to tag that onto Beth's question in the chat. Is it possible to build platform as you build your book? And is there a particular platform that's best for this? How the heck are we supposed to talk to readers when we are getting yanked around by all of these different platforms?
I know the frustration and the confusion. What I would like to offer is this. It's been shifting and changing since 2007, when Facebook first started opening up to people beyond college students. And we're going to keep dealing with these cycles of change forever and ever and ever. I think the most important thing is to find the platform that is sustainable for you and that you can foresee logging into again and again and again for years. Now, yes, some of these platforms might evaporate or disappear. It's nice to have a backup, but I wouldn't worry too much about I don't think Twitter is going to go away. I think it's going to continue in some form. Whether these new entrants become something big or not, who knows? It's not a bad idea to check them out, browse around, start a profile, come back to it later. I mean, when I first joined Twitter, I didn't understand it, but I still created an account. I went back a year later, still didn't like it. Went back 2 years later, and then it was something I actually figured out for myself and wanted to use. So with some of these things, it takes time, time to adjust, time to understand and see the appeal. And then there was a platform question on that. Can you build a platform while writing a book at the same time? And I think that's expected and natural, especially on the nonfiction side, because there are typically issues and problems associated with the book that you're writing about, the themes that we talked about. With fiction, I have a really hard time recommending platform building, capital letters platform building. I would rather you focus on the work and then use social media or other opportunities to build your relationships. So, and here I'm equating platform building to more like kind of hardcore, like social media stuff and trying to gain a readership. I guess I am thinking in terms of the fiction people, I'm thinking of literary citizenship in particular, which is more focused on bringing attention to books and literature, being an engaged member of the bookish community, and not necessarily expecting some sort of A plus B equals book deal outcome. But with nonfiction, I do think it's quite different, especially because of the expectations of agents and publishers.
And I would add to having helped both fiction writers and nonfiction writers work their way towards publishing deals. If you're writing fiction, your best bet is going to be write the best to your genre that you possibly can. If you are a genre writer, really know your genre so that you can both honor it and subvert it. If you are a literary writer, you need to be polishing your prose as much as you possibly can so that your sentences are beautiful, your paragraphs are beautiful, your voice is incredible. And for literary writers and even for serious nonfiction writers, it helps a lot if you can scrape up the money or apply for a grant or do a GoFundMe so that you can go to some conferences and meet some noted teachers one-on-one, where they will later be the people who refer you to their agents, who blurb your book. You know, it's not fair. And it's a system that is loaded towards those with privilege. I remember the first time I ever met Dinty W. Moore, the editor-in-chief of Brevity. It's because at the time I was pretty broke and I scraped up $2,500 plus airfare plus hotel to go to the Kenyon Writers Conference. I could not have afforded to go back, but Dinty had me come back the following year as his teaching fellow. I got paid to be there that time. And that sort of snowballed into basically the rest of my entire writing life. So if you can dredge up the money to go study with someone you admire, it can really pay off in the long run.
I love that. Sue asks, is Medium worth it?
No.
Is it worth the effort?
No, forget it. Move on. Move on. Please move on from Medium. Do not use it.
Why? What makes Medium terrible? Why should we do something else instead? I know you wrote a whole blog about this.
Yeah. It has pivoted more times than I can count. The founder has even given up on it and departed. Who knows how much money is left? It is running on fumes. You do not own the audience that you build there. It will evaporate as soon as the service gets closed down, which eventually it will. And I'm always surprised it hasn't closed yet. If you are somehow, by some miracle, you are earning money off Medium, I congratulate you. Continue to take the money while it's still there and then leave.
Nina and Julie both want to know about Substack. And I got to let you guys know, too, that in 1 month, our February episode will be all about newsletters. We're going to have Janine Willette, who I know a lot of you have coming into your inbox. She's running like 4 different Substack threads. And we've got marketing and branding expert Stephen Nezovich, who used to build Creative Nonfiction Magazine's list and who is going to give us some advice on general marketing and branding stuff. But both Nina and Julie want to know about Substack. I'm feeling overwhelmed by all the ones in my inbox. How can I not support a writer friend? Am I crowding the highway? Is there a reason to build a newsletter and to build a Substack?
I always find it funny when people ask if there's room, because have you looked at how many books are published per year? It's more than the number of Substacks. We're beyond 1 million books per year. So no, there's room for everyone. Don't worry about the crowding. Think about, what do I have to say that's worth people's time? Writing a Substack, at least in my opinion, is really not any different from deciding you want to write a book or deciding you want a channel that complements your book to stay in touch with readers as that process unfolds. Substack's interesting, and for the people who were upset, if there were any upset by my answer about Medium, what I would say is look at Substack instead. It's a much healthier ecosystem to be a part of. You should transition to that. But what's interesting about Substack that I don't think is often appreciated is that if you do build an audience there, you can take it with you. So you can export all those people who get on your list there and, start something that you more fully own and control. I think what can make Substack a little bit confusing from a platform building perspective is that it's both an email newsletter and kind of a website too. So unlike other email newsletters that you may read, like if you read any of my newsletters, they are not on Substack. But if you have a Substack newsletter, it's also online, kind of as a blog post, unless it's behind a paywall. So it's also the equivalent of blogging. It's the equivalent of having a small website. It's the equivalent of having an RSS feed. If you're a blogger, that's then sent to subscribers via email. So it does all of these different things. And I think authors sometimes are confused about where it fits in the bigger picture of the other stuff that they're doing, especially if they're blogging. And I, in fact, had this conversation with children's author Meg Medina last year, where she was like, should I still be blogging anymore? Is that a thing? Is blogging dead? And I think that question often comes up kind of as a cousin to the Substack question, because Substack, let's be honest, it's nothing more than blogging 2.0 or 2020 or, you know, whenever Substack started to take off. So I do think it's helping writers actually make better choices, because you do own what's happening there. It allows you to see how other people are building audiences through the activity of either blogging or email newslettering, however you perceive it. But if you are already blogging, if you are already sending an email newsletter on your own turf, like I am, and like Allison is, Substack is just a tool you don't really need. Too bad it didn't come along 5 or 6 years ago if you were looking for a tool then, but I don't see any reason to transition to it unless you are attracted by the potential of having someone pay for your newsletter in the future, which is hard to do, by the way. I wouldn't join Substack because you think people are going to pay for your email newsletter or blog. They probably will not.
And Jennifer asked a question about that, about migrating her essay series to Substack and having people pay $5 for it. Most of us are at the stage where we need people who want to receive our emails more than we need cash that they might generate for us. I think it's probably better to build a strong list that is used to regularly hearing from you, and that you have something very valuable to dispense on a regular basis. People are very unlikely to pay for essays or short stories. It sucks, but it's true.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people are using newsletters. And my perception is that more people are going to continue to use newsletters. How do you stand out in somebody's inbox? How do you stay relevant?
I would say that the bulk of email newsletters I see from authors, it's very loose. It's too loose. And by that I mean the author hasn't committed to a frequency. They haven't committed to what's going in the newsletter. Even in the sign-up process, they haven't committed to telling people what they're going to get, because there's still this kind of like, what do I have to say? Why would people want to hear from me? Or I'm bothering people when I email them. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that psychology is from just this feeling that email is for selling stuff, which, yes, there are all sorts of retailers and businesses that use email to sell. But with author newsletters, I encourage you to think of it as one of the most intimate ways you can connect with your readership. It's a big deal when someone gives you their email address. And so you want to respect that by being at least sort of disciplined about how you reach out and when you reach out, to ensure that you're, respecting their time. And of course, it respects your own time to have a plan for how you're going to communicate via email. There are lots of different content strategies surrounding sending emails, but I would say the easiest one, and the one that you see most frequently, is what I call the media consumption list. So this is where you're essentially curating a list of stuff that you have read, seen, enjoyed, experienced, listened to, whatever, and putting it in a list for people just to give them a sense of where your head is at these days. Austin Kleon has one that's exactly this. I think it's 10 things every Friday. So think about what you have to share on a consistent basis. It could be the media consumption stuff. It might be a brief personal essay. It could even be repurposing stuff that you've done elsewhere, like on social media, because people will not see everything that you're posting. They're not going to be able to keep up with everything that you do. So the newsletter can act in the truest sense of that word. It is news from the last month or however long. And usually the issue of frequency comes up about right now, like how frequent should you send? And I would say if you're not sending at least once a month, consider how you can get to that frequency. That's only 12 times a year. And I do mean only, like we're not talking about writing a book every month. It doesn't even have to be 500 words. It could be a couple hundred words. It's really about making consistent impressions over time. And you need practice to get better and to understand what people will respond to. So that's why I suggest at least monthly.
And I would say that I like Substack in this one feature, in that if you subscribe to a newsletter, they'll give you people like this person. They'll give you recommendations.
Yes.
I've found a lot of people through Substack's recommendations. So that might be something to consider if you're in that just beginning stage of what you could use.
And I love what Andy added in the chat about the title of your email is important. My last one was called If I Were a Dog and got lots of hits, more than if I had called it In Support of End of Life Options. And I love that because I'm about to write a newsletter that could be titled Writing is Simultaneously Very Easy and Very Hard, but instead I'm going to call it The Secret to Fire Eating. And I bet you it's going to get a pretty good open rate because I am, in fact, going to also pay off that title and reveal the quote unquote secret to fire eating. So look for metaphors, look for things that draw on your own personal experience that you want to share.
I'll add that I think that the subject line is as important as everyone thinks it is. I would also advocate, make sure it's your name and the from line, because normally if you're building your list in a way that's respectful, meaning people have chosen themselves to join your list, you didn't add them, they want to hear from you. And so if you're putting things in the newsletter that are interesting, fun, valuable, it might not even matter what the subject line says. They'll just want to hear what's been going on with you specifically.
So we've got to dive into TikTok. It's kind of the 600-pound gorilla in the room. I'm actually very excited to learn more about TikTok myself. Next week at the Emirates Airline Festival of Literature, note that airline is singular, as our press release says. I'll be sitting down with Annie Arsane, who is the business director for Middle East North Africa for TikTok. And I am really looking forward to asking her about stuff I don't understand. Jane, what the heck is up with TikTok, book talk? What's going on there?
Well, first understand that TikTok is, I feel like there's some new story about TikTok like every month practically. It's growing rapidly. And there's also a lot of like privacy regulations that may affect it in the future. So just please keep all of that in mind. What I say right now may not be relevant next month. For the book publishing industry, it has driven an enormous sales spurt, or geyser would probably be the better word. It's probably responsible for most of the fiction growth that we saw last year. And so that's one of the reasons book publishing and authors have become so obsessed with what's happening there. And that all boils down to the book talk community, which is now so big, it's almost, you almost can't talk about the book talk community as one thing because it's also splintered into different tropes and genres and communities in that. What you see on Book Talk is authentic recommendations from readers to other readers about what they love. It's very emotional. It's not intellectualized. It's not literary criticism. It's just, I love this book, or this book made me so angry, I threw it across the room. And what you get out of that is tropes driving some of these recommendations. So like the enemies to lovers trope. And so you'll find hashtags on Book Talk where people recommend books based on, I want to read more with this trope. Another one would be second chance romance, where you're getting back together with an ex after some period of time. So you can find these all over, and it's led to younger people patronizing bookstores in a way they haven't before and buying more books. It's not just fiction, it's nonfiction too. And it's not just young people, there's old people too. But I'm sure if any of you have walked into a bookstore lately, you've most certainly seen a popular on TikTok display. And many of the bestsellers that you've seen in the last few years probably were on TikTok at one point or another. As far as authors using it, I mean, the sales growth that we're seeing isn't because authors are getting on there and self-promoting. It's reader recommendations, it's word of mouth. So it's not easy to go in and try and self-promote, although some authors are quite successful at doing it because they have a good facility with short form video. And by short form, I mean like 20 to 40 seconds, even 15 seconds, even 10 seconds is acceptable. To have a decent TikTok video. So this is a platform that, if you don't catch someone's attention in the very first second, forget it. And of course, there are tips and tricks that you can go and learn about in order to make that happen. Publishers and agents, as they have with every single social media platform prior to TikTok, are now using it as a way to find new talent. So you will see self-published authors on there doing creative and imaginative things to build a readership, and then publishers or agents are swooping in and picking up the cream of the crop. We're seeing it poetry, nonfiction, and fiction, all genres, all categories. I published a piece recently looking at some of these TikTok authors who've succeeded, if you want to check out their videos, because I think it's really hard to talk about TikTok without actually seeing the content that they're putting up. So I'll put that into the chat here in a second.
So I want to swing back to publishing for a second. We have a really good question from Mira, and it's a question that I hear from underrepresented authors an awful lot. Or a variation of this. Mira says, I'm Indian American. My audience is largely South Asian. I've been successful in building an audience on Instagram, 28,000 plus for my essays. And Mira describes that as a bit successful, but I'm going to say that's successful. She's now working on her debut novel, but her concern with a lot of people who have beta read the books, are the names confusing? What's going on with the cultural influences in dialogue, accents, and so on? Is there an interest in publishing books from BIPOC that doesn't lean into tropes for commercial value?
Yes, absolutely. Like, I don't know if you've had feedback specifically from agents or publishers, like what I would consider a publishing professional. I don't consider beta readers to be publishing professionals typically. So rather than get anxious or nervous about that at this point, which I don't think you should be, once you feel the work is done and is the best you can make it, then I would go out and query agents and editors. If we're talking about things that are names, cultural differences, like that to me feels like if there was an issue there, it would be easily remedied through line editing or through suggestions from your agent or editor. And they would, of course, work with you on that. So I think I would have confidence and move ahead with confidence.
And I want to add, I have worked with a number of BIPOC from different arenas in getting their books towards the market. And there is less and less pressure to quote unquote tour guide your culture for white readers. There is a much stronger sense now that you can trust that if your voice is strong, they will be carried along by it. They might have to Google some words. They might be curious about what that food is and have to look it up. But a lot of the stuff, you can give it to them from context and they will get it from context. And so I'd say write the book that you are called to write, and you can make us white people run behind and catch up so that we can appreciate your brilliance. So we are going to take a quick moment for our breakout rooms. You do not have to go in a breakout room, and it is never as weird as you think it's going to be. We'll come back in 5 minutes when Jane is going to tell us what she is hopeful about in publishing in 2023. And we give you 3 things that you can do today to make your writing, publishing, platforming better. So 5 minutes, just get to know each other, say hello. You do not have to go into a breakout room, and it will not be weird, I promise. Isabel, I did not shove you into a breakout room. Awesome. And I think I'm learning. I made all the breakout rooms a little bit larger this time so that like it was okay if not everybody went into one. And I'm just scanning through, making sure that nobody is left all by themselves. And if you're here in the main room and you have another question for Anne that you would like to ask, now is a great time for a bonus question. So feel free to unmute yourself and speak up if you've got a cue. Nobody has a cue. We have illuminated you all to the point where you're frozen in fear with publishing and platform knowledge.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Jane, do you think there's any platform besides Medium that we should just avoid that's not worth our time?
I mean, aside from the newcomers, which is just too early to say, I don't think so. Medium has been a thorn in my side, as some can probably tell, for quite some time. That's probably the only one I have like a viscerally negative reaction to. My experience with Hive, I was not impressed, and I think it's still consistently going down, if I'm not mistaken. So of the new options that are out there, I feel the least excited about Hive. I think Mastodon has staying power, but as Allison mentioned, it can be very confusing to newcomers, and I'm not sure it's going to get over that. I'm really excited about Discord. It's probably underutilized in the writing and publishing community. It's more popular like in the gaming community with young people, but it's very powerful. And from my perspective, I don't think it's hard to understand, at least not like Mastodon.
Awesome.
Yeah. I use Discord as well. And I do like, it's very similar to Slack, the way it organizes everything. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that about it.
Jane, I know you're writing a book right now. What's your next book?
I'm doing the second edition of The Business of Being a Writer, and I've already blown my first deadline. I may blow my second deadline, so please do not expect that book to come out in the near future. It's been a little tough. It's my first book revision of my career, and I thought, oh well, this will be easy. Writing it was hard. Revising will be a breeze. No, it is not. It is, I find, much more challenging. It's just that, and that's why I've blown every deadline.
What's changing between the last edition and this edition?
Everything. That's the problem. And part of it is just my perspective has shifted on some issues, and I want to try and make the book less susceptible to being out of date, which I paid no attention to the first time around. So there's a lot of reworking that's being done.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it definitely feels like the sands are shifting underneath us in a lot of ways. It's kind of funny because I'm at the stage now where I'm working on a young adult novel because I'd also like to be a novelist. I mean, that's what I wrote first before I wrote about writing. And I think it's going to be lovely. But as the political sands shift, it's got a big school shooting in it. And so my book may or may not be publishable regardless of what I think about it. And that's just the choice you have to make and the risk you have to take when you're writing something and it takes a while. Yeah. So I have just hit close on our breakout rooms and all our people are going to come back in. Hey, Charla, what is happening tomorrow in the Craft Talks webinar?
Yeah, so tomorrow is bringing place to the page with Clinton Peters, and it's going to be on using setting and landscape or place, however you want to think about it, to enliven your stories. So registration closes an hour before the webinar. It's 2 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're interested, I'll pop that into the chat, but I also want to take this moment to plug Jane's webinar that's coming up in March 1st, and it's about literary citizenship and how to make connections in an organic way, no matter if you're an extrovert or an introvert. Shout out to all the introverts out there. So yay. Also, in that link, you can also find her webinar that's coming up, and it's going to be great. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Jane is going to talk about literary citizenship, which is kind of the answer to your question about what the heck should I do from platform. So we're going to tell you 3 things you can do today and also get Jane's hopefulness for publishing in 2023. I want to mention, please do forward the replay to a writer friend. We always welcome new people. We are always free. There is always a replay, and we love people of all genders, races, cultures, genres. Please bring your friends. We would love to have them. As I mentioned, next episode, we are going to take a deep dive into newsletters. So bring back those deep Substack questions. We're going to have marketing and branding expert Stephen Nezovich and rising Substack star Janine Willette, who is both monetizing and doing her Substack for free. So she's going to talk about that. We'll talk about what newsletter platform you should use, how often you should send, and how can you stand out from the crowd. Charla, what's one thing that our community can do today for publishing and platform and feeling great about their work?
I want to encourage everyone, and by everyone, I'm talking to myself here as well, is to be patient with yourself as you're learning something new and to keep your goals manageable. And I think that's just going to be my mantra for 2023.
Love it. Jane, what's one thing they can do today to better their platform and publishing?
Well, one thing I did not mention whatsoever related to social media is LinkedIn, which for me is where a lot of engagement has moved to as people leave Twitter and Facebook. I find that a lot of writers do have a LinkedIn profile, but they just maybe haven't visited it or maintained it or paid any attention to it in years. So I would suggest dusting it off and seeing what happens if you attempt to re-engage there, because for me, it's been the surprise of 2022, just how much commenting and traffic and shares I get out of it.
Wow, I really like that. My one thing for you to do today is to remember that a quote unquote audience is hundreds of personal connections. And if you can, make one connection today. Review somebody else's book, drop a congratulations reply on somebody else's post about something good that happened, or a commiseration reply about somebody who's not great with their writing right now. Reach out to a past teacher with a compliment, because one day you're going to want that teacher to blurb your book. So Jane, we do have some hope going into 2023. What is making you hopeful?
Book sales have been up for 3 years running. They broke records in 2021. 2022 compared very favorably. Book sales are up in the first month of the year versus last year. And I feel like there's also, despite the mergers and acquisitions that have been happening, there is a vibrant, active, independent publisher culture. And by independent publisher, I'm referring both to smaller presses, independent presses outside of New York City, as well as self-publishing authors. So there are many ways to be successful in the industry, more than ever before. And there's always an opportunity. If one door closes, another one will open.
I absolutely love that. Writers Bridge community, thank you so much for being here. We will see you again in a month. The replay link will be coming out before the end of the week. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We love you and we are so glad to have you. Please feel free to unmute yourselves for a joyful goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, everybody.
Ashley.
Thank you.
Darla.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody.
Everyone.